For my thoughts on all the latest happenings in the NFL in a completely relaxed, unscripted format, be sure to check out my channel, JG9 News. And now, on with our feature presentation. The 1975 NFL Draft was a really bad one for the New Orleans Saints. With the team's first-round pick, they drafted this man right here, Purdue wide receiver Larry Burden. Immediately after the Saints drafted Burden, head coach John North said that he was having second thoughts, and that he drafted the wrong player, and would have taken Grambling State defensive tackle Gary Johnson instead. Well, he lived with that regret for the rest of his life, as Johnson became an incredible defensive tackle, making it to 4 Pro Bowls and recording 76.5 sacks in his career, while Burden had 44 catches for 804 yards in his entire career, becoming one of the biggest busts in Saints history. I talked about that whole story in depth 2 years ago, so if you want to learn more about it, you can do so by clicking the card in the upper right corner. Now, it's not to say that the Saints didn't draft some good players that year, but when you got 2 first-round picks, 5 picks in the first 3 rounds, and 7 picks in the first 4 rounds, and you walk away from the draft with the players that they got, yeah, that's insanely disappointing. However, we're going to elaborate on that 1975 draft class today, past the man you're watching right now with Larry Burden, because he was the centerpiece of stink in a draft class that largely stunk for them. Because in the second round, with pick number 32, I want you to imagine the dumbest position you can possibly draft. There are 3 starters on special teams. A punter in the second round with what would be a de facto first round pick today? Yeah, that's pretty stupid. A kicker in the second round with what would be a de facto first round pick today? Also pretty stupid. But there's one more position, and you guessed it, the Saints actually drafted it. In the second round of the 1975 NFL Draft, with the 32nd pick, the Saints, I kid you not, drafted a long snapper. And this is the story behind the stupidest draft pick that you probably never heard of in the near 60-year history of the New Orleans Saints franchise. Before I talk about the draft pick that the Saints made and why it made no sense whatsoever, we need some context to understand the man that everyone thought the Saints were going to take, the man that the Saints were thinking about taking before opting for the other guy, and why that man was so good. The year is 1975, and the New Orleans Saints, in their war room, were torn between 2 guys. We'll get to the second guy in just a bit, but the first guy, as you might have been able to guess, was this man right here, USC running back Anthony Davis, and one of the greatest Trojans of all time. In fact, he might be the greatest player in USC history to never win the Heisman. The Saints' running game in 1974 wasn't anything to write home about. They only scored 9 touchdowns, which was second from the bottom in football, with the Atlanta Falcons being the only team worse than them at finding the end zone on the ground. And no one on the team had more than 2 rushing touchdowns. The Saints only had 2 players run for more than 210 yards, or 15 yards per game. For some perspective, the average NFL team in 1974 had more than 3 guys doing this. So selecting Anthony Davis in round 2 with pick number 32 would have gone a long way toward bolstering an anemic run game on a rather anemic offense. And it's clear why a lot of people loved Anthony Davis, because he was basically a human cheat code every time he touched the ball. He led the Pac-8 in rushing yards in 1972 and in 1974, and he ran for over 1,000 yards in all 3 seasons that he played for USC. He led the Pac-8 in rushing touchdowns in 1972 and 1974, and even finished 3rd in the entire NCAA in this category in 1972. He led the conference in yards from scrimmage and in points scored in 1972 and in 1974. He was a consensus All-American in 1974. He finished 2nd in the Heisman voting in 1974, only behind Ohio State running back Archie Griffin. And by the time Davis's career ended, he had guided the USC Trojans to 3 straight conference titles, 3 straight appearances in the Rose Bowl, and 0 conference losses, with USC claiming a national championship in 1972 and in 1974 as a result. Davis finished his collegiate career at USC with 3,426 rushing yards, and 42 rushing touchdowns, ending his career not just as a member of the Rose Bowl Hall of Fame, and the College Football Hall of Fame for that matter, but ending his career as the leading rusher in USC history. Today, he ranks third, only behind Charles White and Marcus Allen. He was the first player in USC history to ever run for 1,000 yards in 3 consecutive seasons. He was a monster at returning kicks, averaging 34 yards per return, making him the all-time leader in USC history and conference history in this category. He returned 6 kickoffs for a touchdown, which is still a USC record to this day, and his iconic 6-touchdown game in 1972 against Notre Dame still lives on in USC lore and in college football lore more than half a century later. I think you get the idea. Anthony Davis was really freaking good at football. And from all indications, the Saints were going to take him. When he was on the board at pick number 32, and the Saints were on the clock, they were thinking about pulling the trigger, making him their draft pick, and having what seemed on paper like a really solid 1-2 combo at running back with Anthony Davis and Alvin Maxson, their leading rusher from 1974 entering his second season in the league. However, to the surprise of a lot of people, they opted not to do that. Instead, they opted to take the other guy on their board, an offensive lineman out of Auburn by the name of Lee Gross. Now obviously, Gross could play. The Saints scouts got to see him often, seeing as he played nearby in the SEC. And it's not as though Gross didn't earn accolades, as he was a first-team All-SEC member in 1974 and a second-team All-SEC member in 1973. However, to take him over Anthony Davis when you need a running back? That seemed awfully questionable in the eyes of many. And it was about to get way more questionable when the Saints tried to explain just why the heck they did this. Because now, it was time for the Saints to face the music and explain how they could possibly justify passing on Anthony Davis, as in, the man you've been watching this whole time, in order to draft an offensive lineman. The logic was twofold, and both pieces of the logic made absolutely no sense whatsoever. For starters, in the eyes of the Saints, they didn't need a running back. Said Bob Whitman, the Saints director of player personnel, a running back would have felt like a waste of a pick and an unnecessary addition that would not have made the team any better, since they really like Rod McNeil, as in, the team's 4th-round pick out of USC from the previous NFL draft in 1974. McNeil didn't do anything as a rookie, running for 90 yards and a touchdown. That was it. But the Saints were optimistic that he could develop and turn into something special, and be a part of that running back rotation. And look, by itself, I have no problem with that logic. I really don't. Teams pass on players all the time because they believe in the players on their current roster to make a leap, and because they believe that current youngsters have potential. If a team doesn't have a great wide receiving unit, but they drafted 3 wideouts super high the year before, it makes sense that they'll wait another year to see if they develop properly. Now, it obviously didn't work out, as McNeil was off the Saints after the 1975 season, and only finished that 1975 season with 206 rushing yards. But we're not looking at this through hindsight, because that's not the point of this. However, if that was the case, that the Saints were going to expend any high draft capital on a running back because they like Rod McNeil, then why the heck did the Saints literally spend their very next pick on a running back? Because with their 3rd-round pick, they chose Washington State running back Andrew Jones. That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to pass on Anthony Davis if you're just going to do that, does it? That's like if the Minnesota Vikings decide not to take a quarterback with pick number 11 because they believe that Sam Darnold can be the franchise guy. And then they take a quarterback with pick number 23. You get why that logic wouldn't make any sense, right? How can you possibly say, yeah, we don't need a running back early on because we like Rod McNeil, and then take a running back with your very next pick? And if that wasn't enough, the Saints chose 4 more running backs after Jones, meaning that they chose 5 running backs in the 17-round draft. Yep, that is a really sound logic there employed by Bob Whitman. Don't need a running back, so let's draft one with our very next pick, and then spend what feels like every other draft pick on one. So by that logic, passing on this man right here, Anthony Davis, for offensive lineman Lee Gross makes no sense. But then, it keeps going. Because Whitman explained another reason why the Saints decided to pass on Anthony Davis to take Lee Gross. And Whitman said, quite bluntly, he's a long snapper. Seriously. The Saints just admitted that they passed on a running back in order to take a freaking long snapper. As in, a position that you usually don't even draft. And the Saints didn't even need a long snapper. That's probably the most insane part about all of this. They had a perfectly fine long snapper in Dave Thompson. The Saints had no punts get blocked in 1974. A writer even flat out said, Dave Thompson handles that chore of long snapping beautifully. And Thompson was 25 years old in 1974. So you could obviously expect him to be the team's long snapper for a long time if he was doing that job well. Unless you're saying that you can save a roster spot by having someone like Lee Gross pull double duty, but that wouldn't even make sense, because Thompson was already doing that, as he started all 14 games for the Saints at left tackle, along with serving as the long snapper. So what's the point? You drafted a guy with a 32nd pick, which today is a first-round pick, and you drafted him over Anthony Davis because he didn't need a running back, even though he took a bajillion running backs right after, and because Anthony Davis couldn't play long snapper, even though you didn't need a long snapper, you chose a long snapper in the second round? I'm sorry, what? And look, I'm not saying that you had to take Anthony Davis here. Believe me, that is not the point of this video or this argument whatsoever. I am not saying that the Saints were morons for refusing to pick Anthony Davis in the second round with pick number 32 when they were on the clock and when they had the chance to do so. Heck, New Orleans picked Anthony Davis 4 decades later. They could have picked anyone else, and if they did that, half a century later, we're not talking about this and remembering this as one of the most insane draft blunders ever. We're really not. But to say that you didn't really feel as though Davis fit a need, only to take a bunch of other players who fill that need, makes little sense. And as the cherry on top, to say that Davis didn't fill a need, but Gross somehow did, because he could play long snapper when you didn't even need a long snapper? My head hurts. My head just hurts from trying to understand the logic employed by the Saints and personnel man Bob Whitman. It just does. And it's going to come as a shock to absolutely no one that, yeah, the Lee Gross pick was terrible. Instead of choosing the man you've been watching this whole time in USC running back Anthony Davis, taking an offensive lineman because he can long snap was not a good move. Gross only played 3 seasons with the Saints and started a grand total of 0 games. He was out of the NFL after a 1979 season with the Baltimore Colts. So this meant that with the Saints' first 3 draft picks, all of which came inside the top 32, they got a wide receiver in Larry Burden, who had about 800 yards receiving, an offensive lineman in Kurt Schumacher who started 16 games and played 3 seasons, and an offensive lineman who played 3 seasons and started 0 games. And they refused to take a running back because they were dead confident in their running game, even though they took a ton right after, and this backfired, as the Saints had the worst offense in football in 1975, with a rushing offense that ranked 23rd in rushing yards and 25th in yards per carry out of 26 teams. But at least they got their backup long snapper. Good job, New Orleans. Good freaking job. And, yeah, I really think the Saints could have used Anthony Davis. They could have used him big time. He was drafted by the New York Jets in the second round with pick number 37, so shortly after the Saints drafted their backup long snapper. He never came to terms with the Jets because he spurned them to join the World Football League, joining the Southern California Sun. And in that league, he was incredible. The WFL went under, but when Davis was playing in that league, he was exceptional. He had over 1,200 rushing yards, which was the top total in the league by about 400 yards. He had over 5 yards a carry, and he had 16 rushing touchdowns, which was 6 more than second place. Anthony Davis was a phenomenal running back in the pros, and if the Saints could have drafted him and signed him, it would have been a great draft pick for them. This team behind me right here would have done very well. But nope, gotta get that backup long snapper. Good going. The 1975 New Orleans Saints could have had an incredible draft if any time they were torn between two options, they chose the exact opposite one. Seriously, if they went with Gary Johnson in round 1 and then Anthony Davis in round 2 and they were able to sign him, unlike the New York Jets, it would have been a phenomenal draft. And I think this should go without saying. But if you're on the clock with pick number 32, so a first-round pick today, and you're even thinking about taking a backup long snapper with that draft capital, just don't do it. Hand in your resignation right now, fire yourself, go to the nearest hospital, and get your brain checked out. Just do anything else but what the Saints did here. Because in 1975, their decision in the second round to pass on this man right here, Anthony Davis, to take Lee Gross, well, it was just flat out gross. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.